You think being exhausted by social interactions means something is wrong with you? Maslow discovered something that challenges how we interpret social fatigue. In his research on self-actualized individuals, he found that many psychologically developed people experienced social situations as genuinely draining, not from social anxiety or deficit, but from operating at different psychological frequencies that made typical social interaction energetically costly. These highly developed people weren't socially deficient. They were experiencing real incompatibility between their consciousness and conventional social demands. The most important part? Maslow identified that social exhaustion can indicate multiple opposite things depending on what's causing it. It might signal psychological development, or it might signal unhealed wounds that need attention. This isn't about flattering yourself that exhaustion equals superiority. This is about understanding what social fatigue actually reveals about your developmental stage, temperament, and psychological needs, and distinguishing between social exhaustion that indicates healthy development versus exhaustion that indicates problems requiring different responses prevents both false superiority and unnecessary self-criticism. Not every person exhausted by social interaction is experiencing the same phenomenon. There's a critical difference between social exhaustion from operating at different developmental levels, exhaustion from high sensitivity or introversion, exhaustion from unhealed social trauma, and exhaustion from social anxiety or avoidance. Maslow observed that these look identical from outside, someone avoiding or limiting social contact, but they originate from completely different psychological sources and require opposite responses. Some people are exhausted by social interaction because they've developed beyond a psychological level where typical socializing occurs, and the constant translation required is genuinely depleting. But others are exhausted because socializing triggers wounds, anxiety, or overwhelm that hasn't been addressed. The pattern matters enormously because interpreting social exhaustion as evidence of development when it actually indicates trauma or anxiety prevents the healing work needed. What appears as the same social fatigue from outside reflects entirely different internal realities. Real understanding requires honest examination of which pattern you're experiencing rather than assuming exhaustion equals advancement. In this video, I'm going to reveal what actually causes social exhaustion from a psychological perspective, what Maslow observed about self-actualized people's relationship with socializing, and how to distinguish between social fatigue that indicates development versus fatigue that indicates problems needing attention. You'll discover the multiple sources of social exhaustion, why some indicate healthy boundaries while others indicate unmet needs, and what your specific pattern reveals about your psychological state. These are insights from humanistic psychology, temperament research, and trauma psychology about what social fatigue actually means. By the end, you'll understand what your exhaustion from social situations genuinely indicates, without flattery or false superiority, but also without unnecessary self-criticism. This isn't a video telling you that being drained by socializing means you're more evolved than others. This is psychology explaining the multiple reasons social interaction exhausts certain people and what each reason indicates about your development and needs. This video is for people who feel exhausted after social situations and want to understand why, without either inflating it into evidence of superiority or pathologizing it as deficiency. If socializing drains you, if you need extensive recovery time after interactions, if you find typical conversation exhausting, you're about to understand the actual psychological mechanisms creating that experience and what they reveal about you. If you're ready for honest examination rather than flattery, keep watching. Think about the last social gathering you attended. Notice what specifically exhausted you. Was it the effort of translating your actual thoughts into socially acceptable conversation? Was it anxiety about being evaluated or judged? Was it sensory overwhelm from noise, lights, and stimulation? Was it emotional labor of managing others' feelings? Was it simply that your nervous system processes social information more deeply and requires more recovery time? That specific quality of exhaustion contains crucial information about what's actually happening. Maslow understood that behavior, like limiting social contact, can serve completely different psychological functions in different people, and understanding which function it serves for you determines whether it indicates health or whether it indicates something needing attention. The psychological weight of social exhaustion is real regardless of its source, but the meaning and appropriate response differ dramatically depending on whether you're experiencing developmental difference, temperamental variation, trauma response, or anxiety. Most people experiencing social fatigue don't examine which pattern they're in. They either decide they're defective or decide they're superior to social people. Both interpretations miss the actual dynamics. Maslow's research provides one piece of the framework. He documented that self-actualized people often showed what he called detachment and preference for solitude. They could engage socially when they chose, but didn't need constant social stimulation, and often found typical social situations less satisfying than solitude or deep one-on-one conversations. This wasn't social anxiety. They had proven capacity for intimacy and connection. It was that typical socializing didn't engage them at the level they operated from. The small talk, status games, and surface interactions that constitute much social activity felt empty to them, and participating required adapting their consciousness to more superficial level. This adaptation was effortful, making socializing genuinely tiring. But Maslow was careful not to say that all solitude preference or social exhaustion indicated self-actualization. He distinguished this pattern from social anxiety, schizoid withdrawal, and trauma-based isolation. The key markers he identified: self-actualized people who preferred solitude maintained capacity for deep intimacy when they chose it, weren't lonely in solitude, and were using alone time generatively rather than avoiding life. But the temperament researcher Elaine Aron documented an entirely different source of social exhaustion: sensory processing sensitivity. She found approximately 20% of people have nervous systems that process sensory and social information more deeply, leading to quicker overwhelm in stimulating environments. For highly sensitive people, socializing is exhausting not because they're more developed, but because their nervous systems are processing more information from every interaction. They notice subtleties others miss, pick up on emotional undercurrents automatically, and become overstimulated more quickly. This is neurobiological difference, not developmental level. The psychologist Bessel van der Kolk studied trauma extensively and found that people with unresolved social trauma often experience socializing as exhausting because it triggers hypervigilance, threat detection, and defensive responses. Their nervous systems learn that social situations are potentially dangerous, so even safe interactions activate stress responses. The exhaustion is real, but it's from managing triggered trauma responses rather than from consciousness mismatch or sensitivity. The clinical psychologist Ellen Hendrickson studied social anxiety and documented that people with anxiety disorders find socializing exhausting from the constant effort of managing anxiety, monitoring for threats, suppressing anxiety symptoms, engaging while flooded with stress hormones. This is completely different from the other patterns, but produces similar avoidance of social situations. But here's what examining these different sources reveals about what social exhaustion actually indicates in your specific case, and why honest self-assessment matters more than flattering interpretations. First pattern: developmental difference exhaustion. This is what Maslow observed. You're operating from developmental level where typical conversation feels superficial or empty. You can engage, but it requires translating your actual consciousness to level that others relate to, and translation is tiring. Signs you're experiencing this: you maintain capacity for deep connection with people at similar developmental levels. Your exhaustion is specifically from superficial interaction, while depth energizes you. You use solitude time generally for growth/creativity/learning. You're not lonely or anxious in solitude, and you can engage socially when needed without anxiety. It's just not particularly nourishing. If this is your pattern, your social exhaustion likely reflects genuine developmental reality. You develop beyond where most socializing occurs, and limiting superficial contact while seeking depth is healthy response. Second pattern: temperament-based exhaustion. This is high sensitivity. Your nervous system processes more information, making social situations genuinely more depleting. Signs you're experiencing this: you're exhausted by social situations, even with people you love and feel safe with. You need recovery time after all social interaction, regardless of depth. You're also more affected by other sensory inputs: noise, lights, textures. You can engage deeply, but still need substantial alone time to recover, and the exhaustion is physical/energetic rather than psychological. If this is your pattern, your social exhaustion reflects nervous system characteristics. You're not more developed, you're differently calibrated, and honoring your recovery needs is respecting your biology. Third pattern: trauma-based exhaustion. This is when socializing exhausts you because it triggers unhealed wounds, activates threat responses, or requires managing trauma reactions. Signs you're experiencing this: you feel anxious or hypervigilant in social situations even when objectively safe. You're monitoring for danger/rejection/judgment constantly. You're exhausted from suppressing trigger responses. Your history includes relational trauma or adverse social experiences, and you feel relief when leaving social situations primarily because threat has ended. If this is your pattern, your social exhaustion indicates unhealed trauma requiring therapeutic work. It's not about development or temperament, but about wounds needing attention. The exhaustion won't resolve through accepting yourself as introverted. It resolves through trauma healing. Fourth pattern: anxiety-based exhaustion. This is when socializing exhausts you because you're managing social anxiety throughout interaction. Signs you're experiencing this: you're anxious before, during, and after social situations. You're constantly evaluating how you're being perceived. You're suppressing anxiety symptoms while trying to appear normal. You ruminate after interactions about what you said or how you appeared, and avoidance provides relief from anxiety rather than from genuine preference for solitude. If this is your pattern, your social exhaustion indicates anxiety disorder requiring treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure work, or medication. Interpreting it as introversion or development prevents addressing the actual problem. Fifth pattern: mixed pattern exhaustion. Many people experience combinations. Perhaps you have high sensitivity plus some developmental difference, or trauma history plus introverted temperament. The patterns aren't mutually exclusive, which is why careful self-examination is needed to understand what's operating in your specific case. The transformation that occurs when you accurately identify which pattern creates your social exhaustion is that you can respond appropriately rather than either inflating it into superiority or criticizing yourself for deficiency. Remember that confusion about whether your social fatigue meant something was wrong with you or whether you were just different. When you identify your actual pattern, that confusion resolves. If you recognize developmental difference pattern, you can stop forcing yourself into superficial socializing that doesn't serve you while actively seeking the depth connections that do. You're not broken. You develop in ways that make typical socializing less relevant. If you recognize temperament pattern, you can honor your recovery needs without shame while building life that respects your nervous system. You're not antisocial. You're highly sensitive, and that requires specific self-care. If you recognize trauma pattern, you can pursue healing work rather than accepting isolation as permanent state. Your exhaustion isn't character flaw or unchangeable trait. It's symptom of unhealed wounds that can be addressed. If you recognize anxiety pattern, you can seek appropriate treatment rather than avoiding situations indefinitely. Your exhaustion isn't indicating you're too evolved for socializing. It's indicating you have treatable condition affecting your functioning. If you recognize mixed patterns, you can address what needs healing while honoring what's temperament or development. Your social exhaustion becomes information rather than source of confusion or false identity. Your relationships often improve because you're responding to your actual needs rather than to misinterpretations. You seek appropriate depth for developmental pattern, appropriate recovery for sensitivity, appropriate healing for trauma, appropriate treatment for anxiety. Your self-understanding increases because you've examined yourself honestly rather than accepting flattering or critical narratives without investigation. Now, here's where understanding becomes practically useful and where you can assess which pattern you're actually experiencing rather than assuming exhaustion equals development. Ask yourself these questions honestly. Can you engage in deep, meaningful conversation with safe people without exhaustion, or does all social interaction deplete you regardless of depth? If depth energizes you, you might be experiencing developmental difference. If all socializing exhausts you even when meaningful, you're likely experiencing temperament or trauma patterns. Do you feel lonely, or do you feel content in solitude? Developmental difference and healthy temperament create contentment in aloneness. Trauma and anxiety often create lonely isolation, even though socializing feels impossible. Is your alone time generative? Are you creating, learning, growing, thinking deeply? Or is it primarily recovery, avoidance, or numbing? Developmental difference uses solitude productively. Trauma and anxiety often fill alone time with recovery or avoidance behaviors. Can you socialize without anxiety when needed, Or does anticipating social situations create dread? Developmental difference in temperament allow flexible engagement without anxiety. Trauma and anxiety create dread and avoidance even when situations are objectively safe. Do you have close relationships where you feel genuinely connected? Or are you isolated even from potentially safe people? Developmental difference maintains selected deep connections. Trauma and anxiety often prevent connection even when desired. Is your social limitation a choice serving your well-being, or is it driven by fear, pain, or avoidance? Choice indicates healthy patterns. Fear indicates healing work needed. Your honest answers to these questions reveal which pattern you're experiencing. And understanding your pattern reveals what response serves you, whether that's protecting your boundaries, honoring your temperament, pursuing trauma therapy, treating anxiety, or some combination. Here's what actually makes this topic important rather than just an opportunity for false superiority. Social exhaustion, regardless of source, is real and deserves understanding rather than judgment. But the interpretation matters enormously because it determines your response. If you misidentify trauma-based exhaustion as developmental advancement, you never pursue the healing that would actually reduce your suffering. If you misidentify developmental difference as social anxiety disorder, you pursue unnecessary treatment and feel inadequate for not changing when actually you're responding appropriately to your development. If you misidentify temperament as pathology, you exhaust yourself trying to become extrovert when actually you need to honor your nervous system. The framework Maslow provides is one piece. Yes, self-actualized people often prefer solitude and find typical socializing less nourishing. But that observation becomes dangerous when people use it to avoid examining whether their social exhaustion might indicate problems needing attention rather than development deserving celebration. The healthiest approach is examining all possibilities honestly. Am I exhausted because I developed beyond superficial interaction? Am I exhausted because my nervous system is highly sensitive? Am I exhausted because I'm managing unhealed trauma? Am I exhausted because I have social anxiety? The answer might be complex, multiple factors contributing. But understanding your actual dynamics allows appropriate response rather than false narratives that either inflate or pathologize what's happening. If your social exhaustion genuinely reflects developmental difference, you can engage deeply but superficial interaction feels empty, then Maslow's observation applies. You likely develop in ways that make typical socializing less relevant, and honoring that while seeking appropriate depth is healthy. But if your honest examination reveals trauma, anxiety, or patterns preventing desired connection, then your exhaustion is indicating healing work needed rather than development achieved. Either way, you deserve accurate understanding rather than flattery that prevents growth or criticism that creates shame. In the next video, I'm going to reveal the specific practices that support each pattern, how to build life that honors developmental needs, temperamental needs, or addresses trauma and anxiety, depending on what's actually operating. Until then, examine your social exhaustion honestly rather than using it to feel superior or defective. What it reveals about you depends entirely on its source, and only you can determine that through honest self-reflection. Subscribe if you want psychology that provides real insight rather than flattering narratives, that distinguishes between patterns requiring different responses, and that supports actual understanding over comfortable illusions about yourself.